Hello, and welcome to Trusts and Estates Weekly. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and we're kicking off a new week here at 10 a.m. Pacific Time, 1 p.m. Eastern Time, to talk about all things related to trusts, estates, probate, whether it's from your own personal estate planning or whether you're a professional who's involved in that field or looking to get involved as a way to enhance your business. So today I want to talk about one of, I think, the most common estate planning tools that you'll hear about, and that's something called a living trust. So these have been around for quite a long time. I know back when I started my real estate career, which dates back to the mid 1980s, they called them inter vivos trusts, which I think is well, I know it's Latin, but inter vivos is essentially like living trust, right? Vivos, life. And they become a more accessible estate planning tool for more and more people as the cost to have a living trust has declined, and as they become better understood by attorneys and accountants and other people involved in estate planning. And so I think this is of course, it's not going to be individual excuse me. This is not going to be individual legal tax advice, anything like that. We're going to cover just some basics about living trusts, so that you can understand what they're all about and have a sense of whether this is something to talk to your advisors about. And by the way, if you don't have an advisor, you can always feel free to reach out to me. I'll be happy to refer you to someone in your jurisdiction. Living trusts are they're created under state law, basically. And so someone in California, a lawyer in California, unless they're admitted to practicing in multiple states, is not going to be the person for you to use. So if you're located in New York or Alabama or Florida or Texas or Idaho or whatever, you'll want someone there locally. I'll be happy to make that referral for you, and if that will help you out. So as has been my practice, I have created a little PowerPoint, and here we go. Okay. Right. Trusts and Estates Weekly. For those of you who are familiar with the show, I'm sure this looks familiar to you. This is our regular background. And as always, I take just a moment to mention the three pillars of attainment. So on Trusts and Estates Weekly, generally speaking, we're dealing in the finances realm of the pursuits pillar. However, because it oftentimes, I should say, estate planning almost always deals with relationships, family, friends, colleagues. These other issues come into it, and you see, we will touch on those today. And I think too that our mindset, our identity, so the self pillar can work in this as well. And by the way, if you're new to the show and like, what's this whole three pillars of attainment about? Please feel free to go to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/@thewaytowwow. There is a show there talking just about the three pillars of attainment and what it's all about. Okay, so let's jump in here right now with living trusts. Okay, so first of all, they're known by other names. You see there, AKA, also known as revocable living trust or a revocable trust. So if you recall, last week or the week before, we talked about special needs trusts, which are typically set up to make sure that a loved one or someone we care about has what they need in order to be taken care of, typically because they have some kind of disability or something like that. And those trusts were irrevocable, typically. Okay. living trusts are revocable. So what that means is during the life of the grantor or the trustor or the settlor, all of those terms mean the same thing. It's the person or people who create the trust, okay? So a revocable trust is one that they can change or dissolve during their lifetime, okay? And so that's why it's probably more accurate to call it a revocable living trust. But keep in mind that once the grantor dies, the grantors die, now the trust becomes irrevocable. Okay, so there is that shift in status, if you will, for a living trust. And so that's why I think these days they just tend to be referred to as living trusts. But in any event, the good thing about them is, the good thing about them is, the grantors can make changes while they're alive. Okay, so one of the key aspects about a living trust is that it allows the grantors typically to control their assets not only during their lifetime but after death. Okay, so it's very common for the grantor or grantors to also be the trustee. Okay, and you see there in the third bullet that the living trust is managed by a trustee, or in some cases there can be co-trustees where there's more than one. All right. It's not unusual for the grantor to also be the trustee, and then there's a successor trustee who takes over at the point where the grantor dies. Now the trust becomes irrevocable, and the successor trustee steps into the trustee's job, if you will, and sees to it that the terms of the trust are executed in accordance with the grantor's wishes as they are specified in the trust document. Okay, now it's not required for the grantor to be the trustee. Okay, and I had a case a few years ago where there was a living trust, a husband and a wife. The husband passed away, leaving the wife and one of her children as the trustees. And the wife decided she just did not want to do this. She didn't want to have her daughter do it. And so she asked me to be the trustee. And so I was substituted in. That's the process by which a trustee is replaced. Okay. And she was able to do that because since she was still alive, it was still a revocable trust. Okay. So in this case, I managed the trust. She was the beneficiary of the trust. And so I managed it for her benefit, hence the term, beneficiary, right? And then sadly, she passed away about a year later, almost exactly a year after her husband. And then I managed the trust on behalf of the successor beneficiaries. Okay, so that's sort of a picture of the life of a living trust, if you will. All right, so who would use a living trust? Well, first of all, people with complex estates. Now, that word complex may sound a little scary, but I have a friend here in California who is involved in the real estate business, and he feels that anyone who owns a house in California needs to have a living trust. Because once you own a house in California, you already have a substantial asset. Okay, I'm not sure what the median home price is in California, but it's higher than the national average. National average is in the 400s, I think. So it could be five, six, $700,000 median home price in California, and that's, as we joke, that's real money, and it almost by definition could make your estate complex. Now, again, this is not legal or estate planning advice that I'm giving you. I'm just passing along that complex can mean a lot of different assets, a lot of difficult to deal with assets, but can also just mean a significant dollar amount, especially in light of the second item there, people who want to avoid probate. So if you own your house, especially if you own it free and clear, let's say it's worth, $600,000-700,000. So, do you really want to have to go through probate and deal with that whole legal, I don't want to call it mess, but that whole legal process? And probably not. Okay. And there's no way that if you have a house, well, I shouldn't say no way, but it's extremely unlikely if you have a house worth that kind of money that you're going to be able to avoid probate in the absence of some mechanism that's been created to do that. Okay, so that's another aspect of who would use a living trust. Say, third one is people who want to maintain control of their assets. So this goes back to what I was saying in the previous slide. So when you set up a living trust, you still are in control of your assets, especially if you are your own trustee. Excuse me. So, just because it's transferred to a trust, it does not mean that you have lost control of it. Indeed, you maintain control of it. And in fact, because the trust is revocable during your lifetime, you're not going to file a separate, because the trust is revocable during your lifetime, you're not going to file a separate tax return for the trust. So although the assets will be in the name of the trust, any tax consequences of the trust's activities are going to pass through to you as an individual, and you'll report them on your own tax return. Okay. And then finally, people who want to plan for incapacity. So, let's say that there's, I don't know, a history of Alzheimer's in your family. Okay. And you want to make sure that you're not leaving your family in a bind. Excuse me. You don't want to leave your family in a bind. So the living trust allows you to plan for the eventuality that you may not be able to handle your own business affairs. Okay. And so while you may you'll be the grantor and you may initially be the trustee, there may be a mechanism there such that when you become incapacitated, another trustee takes over and things can proceed in accordance with your wishes. All right, next. So who might benefit then from a living trust? Well, certainly parents of minor children will benefit, because it will allow them to pass their wealth to their children, even though they're minors, and make sure that things are handled by the successor trustee in the way that they want. As well, people with blended families. Okay, so a living trust that sets out what's to happen with which assets, related to which spouse and which spouse's children, etc. All of that can be carefully worked out in the living trust, so that you can reduce, if not eliminate, potential for family conflict. And that can be a big benefit, especially in blended families where you might have both spouses might have children from a previous marriage, and then maybe they have children together, and the children from the previous marriages may feel like, the children they had together, they get treated better, and all that kind of stuff that can go on with families. So a trust can, like I say, minimize, if not completely eliminate, a lot of that family friction. Okay, people with special needs beneficiaries. So in this case, the special needs beneficiaries may not even be minors. They may be legally adults, and yet let's say you have a child who's neurodiverse, and that child needs some additional support. So you may be you can set up a living trust in a way that it will, even after your death, see to it that your child has the resources that he needs to be taken care of, and that there's someone there to help your child if he's not able to handle all of his own affairs himself. Okay, business owners. So if you are business owners who are not family members, nonetheless, you can set up a living trust so that what happens with the business after one or all of the owners dies is specified. And again, it prevents fighting among the remaining partners or among the family members of the deceased partners, right? There's nothing like assets on the table to raise the likelihood that people will get into disputes. And so business owners can set up a living trust that's specifically dealing with the business's assets. And by the way, you can have more than one living trust. There's nothing that says you can only have one. So depending on what your situation is and the complexity of it, you may very well need to have more than one. Okay, finally, people who own property in multiple states. So if you own real estate in, let's say, California and Nebraska and I don't know, Michigan, right? How is that all going to be handled? So a living trust can specify jurisdictionally how all that's going to be handled, and it can make sure that much of the problems that can come from dealing cross-jurisdictionally are handled within the trust, and it's specified this is how I want this handled, this is how I want this handled, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so that can all be specified and worked out in advance, and can actually save a tremendous amount of money in attorney's fees. If all that's worked out up front and doesn't have to be litigated after your death, or worse, get the whole estate tied up in multiple jurisdictions, and oh my gosh, then it becomes just an absolute nightmare. Okay, so these are some of the people. This is not an exhaustive list, but some of the more common people who might benefit from having a trust. Oops, I don't know why I went backward. Okay, so let's talk about now some of the benefits of a living trust. Let me just check the time here. Okay, yeah, we're doing well. All right, first of all, and I mentioned this earlier, probate avoidance. Now, I'm not going to get into the specifics of probate. I've talked about that in a previous show, and I invite you again to go to our YouTube channel and check that out if you want to know more about probate. But suffice it to say, probate is a legal process. It requires the filing of what amounts to a lawsuit, not a contentious lawsuit, but a legal action is probably a better word. It requires the filing of a legal action in court, okay? And the court will oversee the administration or the execution of the estate, okay? And as a result, there are costs. There are legal costs, there are court costs. At times, there may be a need for experts to be brought in, so there's costs associated with that. And there's also time, okay? So probate does not necessarily move quickly. Okay. I like during COVID, for example, probates moved very slowly because the courts were initially shut down, and they had to figure out how were they going to hold hearings remotely and all of that. So some of that has been, worked out now and more streamlined, and yet there are still backlogs. And so there's also the time factor. Okay. So many people want to avoid probate. Now, there are other ways of avoiding probate besides a living trust. And again, I've talked about that in a previous show. But if you have any kind of substantial assets, it can be difficult to avoid probate in the absence of a living trust or some mechanism like that. Okay. So probate avoidance and the avoidance of the cost and time and aggravation is a big benefit of a living trust. The next is privacy. So unlike a probate, which because it's a court action, is open to public scrutiny, a living trust is private. You're not required to record the trust or file the trust with the court. So no one needs to know about it beyond those who you specifically want to know about. Okay, so that again, for people who just they don't want to trot out their personal financial affairs in public. So a living trust is a good way to avoid that. Okay, these days, I want to be careful how I say this, where with so much stuff online, with people trolling other people and doxing and all that kind of stuff, it's harder and harder to maintain our privacy. And so, although a living trust is not a simple document, it is one of the simplest ways, and one of the most effective ways of maintaining privacy. Okay, and then next is incapacitation protection. So we spoke about that in a previous slide. Even if you don't have a history of some kind of debilitating disease or sort of a gradual loss of ability to function, and even if there's not a history of that in your family, nonetheless, people are living a lot longer now. In fact, I think I saw a billboard. This is now, I guess, a few months ago. Like the average child who is born today, I think, is going to live to at least 100 years old or something like that, right? So with longevity comes a greater likelihood of incapacitation, at least even just partial incapacitation, and for a longer period of time. And so that being the case, it can be prudent to plan for it. And in the end, if it doesn't happen, so okay, no big deal. Yes, you may have spent some time and money planning for it, but better to be prepared than not. Okay, and it can make things much easier, not only on yourself, but on your children or your spouse or those who are going to have to step up and make sure that you're properly cared for. Okay, and then finally, flexibility. So because a living trust is revocable, it can be changed, and it allows you over time to make changes to your estate plan. So let's say that you're married, and your spouse passes away. Now you're unmarried, and let's say a few years later you decide to get married again. So what you've got in your current living trust is not set in stone. You can change it. Okay, or maybe unfortunately you become estranged from one of your children. Okay, so that allows you to make changes, or maybe better, maybe you become reunited with an estranged child, and you want to, bring them back into your estate plan. So all of that can be accomplished through a living trust. which makes it, again, a very good estate planning tool. Okay, and I think this is going to be our last slide. We're probably coming up on time here. Yes, we are. Okay, so what are some of the limitations of a living trust? Well, first of all, cost. There is a cost to creating a living trust. This is not a document that you want to write on your own. You want to make sure that you have competent representation that knows the laws in the jurisdiction or jurisdictions in which your estate plan needs to be built. Okay, and so there are costs to that. Now, as I mentioned, the cost today, I remember when I was a law clerk, okay, the cost of doing a trust back then, and this is going back, close to 40 years now, it was the same as it is today, which is another way of saying, because there's been inflation, it was probably at least, double or maybe even triple the cost 40 years ago of what they are today. Okay. And in some cases, the cost today is lower in just dollars than it was when I was a law clerk. And so, the costs have come down. Okay. Now, obviously, if you have a very complex estate, multi-jurisdictional and that kind of thing, so then that is going to add to the cost. But nonetheless, it is a limitation, but something that is, I think, well worth examining the cost benefit, if you will, before you just out of hand reject a living trust. Okay, the next is complexity. While a living trust can help you avoid complexity, help your heirs avoid complexity is probably a better way of putting it, right? After you die, putting together the drafting of the trust and making sure that it conforms with you or you and your co-trustor's wishes. There's some complexity there. There is other complexity that comes from needing assets to be transferred to the trust. In order for the trust to be useful, your assets have to be in the name of the trust, but not every asset necessarily should be transferred to your trust. Okay, so should life insurance be transferred to your trust? Maybe not. It depends on your specific situation. Should your car be transferred to your trust? Maybe not. So in a lot of jurisdictions, when one spouse dies, the car automatically transfers to their spouse, so it doesn't need to be in a trust. Okay, but maybe if you've got a very expensive car or something like that, and you want to make sure there's no hiccups, or maybe you want your car to go to someone besides your spouse, so then maybe it does need to be in your trust. So all of these individual issues do need to be dealt with so that the living trust can function most efficiently for what you want to have happen. Okay, so that's another limitation, is its complexity. Third is it requires ongoing maintenance in the sense that this is not something that you do once and you file it away and you never look at it again. You do need to periodically review it. Your overall estate plan should be periodically reviewed. So if you have a living trust, that's something that you're going to need to include in your periodic review. Now, does it need to be reviewed every 3 months or every 6 months? Probably not. Every year? Maybe. I mean, it depends how much change is going on in your life. Certainly, if you have a living trust with your spouse and your spouse passes away, that's probably a time for, you to, review your living trust. If one of your children gets married, that may be another, triggering event to reviewing it, aside from whatever the regular review schedule is that you set up with your advisors. But again, this is not something that you do once and you just put it in a folder and don't worry about it. Now, people do treat their wills that way. That's probably not wise either. But certainly, if you've gone to the trouble and expense of creating a living trust, you want to make sure that you're taking care of ongoing maintenance. Finally, a living trust may not give you creditor protection. Okay, so this is a complex issue. It can vary from state to state. Okay, so whereas in an irrevocable trust, it's more likely that the assets of the trust will be protected from a creditor who's coming after you as an individual. A living trust may not do that. Now, again, this is something that you'll want, if it's a concern, you'll want to discuss this with your advisors so they can tell you more specifically how things work in your jurisdiction, and how things may work with respect to specific assets, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, but just realize that one of the reasons for setting up trusts in general is creditor protection, but there are limitations to that with a living trust, and that is something you want to take a look at. Okay, and I think that is it. Yes, so if you have any questions or would like to get some help or need a referral, as I mentioned earlier, by all means, please feel free to reach out to me. You see the show's email there on the screen. This will also be in the show notes. You see some of our social media links there. All of our social media will be linked in the show notes. You can always post a comment, or if it's something personal, maybe don't post a comment, maybe, send a direct message, something like that. Okay. And if we're not connected, if you, want to direct message me and need to connect. So just, that you can post on social media, say, hey, Kevin, have a personal question. I want to DM you. Would you connect with me? Happy to do it. And that way we can, communicate privately. And there was something else I was going to say about that. Oh, and if you have a question or a comment that's kind of more general and that other people, would benefit from hearing the answer, then by all means, feel free to post that as a comment, and either I will respond, or if it's something, out of my area of expertise, so then I'll reach out to a colleague and say, hey, I had a viewer of my show ask about this, what do you think? And they'll respond. And that way you can be reasonably assured you're getting a competent response. Okay. And I think we just have the legal stuff, right? There we go. Copyright. We're going to stop the share. Okay, we're a few minutes over, but that's okay. So that is the show for today, and hope you found it informative and useful. This is, a great tool, and I know I have a living trust, and am glad that I did it. I forgot who recommended it to me, or maybe I decided on my own that I needed to set one up. I don't remember now. It's been a while. But in any event, I do encourage you, don't leave these things for the last minute. It takes time to figure out how the trust should be drafted, to get it drafted, to go over it, get it properly executed, and then transfer property to it. So all of that is a lengthy process. You're probably not going to accomplish it in even a month or two. You're probably looking at minimum of a 3 to 6 month time period, and if you have a lot of property, then easily could be even longer than that. So and you don't want to be doing this under time pressure. You want to be able to proceed with caution and make sure that everything's being handled the way you want it to be handled. So I thank you very much for joining me today. And just to mention, tomorrow at 11 a.m. Pacific time is my show, Business Lessons from the Military. We're talking about intelligence and how we can apply the idea of military intelligence to the business world. And then on Wednesday at 12:30 p.m., my guest is Deshama Gordon. She's an author, filmmaker, teacher, yoga instructor. has had a fascinating professional life, and I think you will very much enjoy hearing Deshama's thoughts on professional success and how to live a life worth living. So again, that's People Making Money, 12:30 on Wednesday. And then a week from today, we will be back for the next edition of Trusts and Estates Weekly. So I thank you again for joining me and wishing you a wonderful rest of the day, and signing off as always, Marie, you're my belle. All the best, folks.